I'd like to record there. Great. Yeah, so Juudit is an associate professor at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, NTNU in Trondheim. She currently works on the following themes: circular economy, carbon sequestration and storage, and consumption, behavior and environmental footprints in the context of the built environment. Judith's presentation will be followed by a discussant, Lucas Rainer Boudet. Lucas is a PhD candidate here at Nordic, whose research deals with potential policy interventions and structural changes of economies in high-income countries to provide for good lives in ways that are compatible with ecological limits, such as the planetary boundaries. After Lucas' discussion, we'll have open floor for the audience to engage in the discussion. So we are expecting first to have a brief introduction by Lucas, who's going to explain us what's the purpose of holding this seminar. Then Judith's presentation, aiming to around 40 minutes. I will let you know if we're running out of time. And then Lucas' discussion, 10 minutes approximately, and then we have 30 or 40 minutes for open floor, depending on how it goes. Yeah, so the floor is yours, Lucas.
Yes, I have 2 or 3 slides to make my points, so you can also launch this one. Yeah, just so that.
Can you see the presentation, Elizabeth? Yeah. I forgot how to use Zoom already. Okay, I think you can.
Yeah, should be working. Okay. I just wanted to say a few words about what social metabolism and political ecology are, because I think that we have a very heterogeneous crew and people don't really come from the same background. So just that we know largely what we talk about in a few words, and also why actually we thought it was interesting to talk about social metabolism in a forum that is supposed to be dedicated to political ecology. So just to say a few words, and I think you will talk better than me about it, for people to know about what social metabolism is and social metabolic research. It actually came from an analogy that was found, in analyzing societies as complex systems and systems that behave somehow in the same way as other metabolic organisms and cells, for example, that we define certain characteristics that they can actually maintain themselves. They have this property of being complex systems that are able to use energy and materials from the outside to maintain themselves and to reproduce themselves. And they are also complex systems because the emergent behaviors that you can see at the macro scale of a cell, for example, or of a society doesn't equal the sum of the subcomponents. So there were like this kind of similarities that were observed in a way that metabolic organisms in a general way were behaving, and in the 90s this field of social metabolism developed. You can, at the same time, maybe go now to the next slide. This field developed to try to analyze societies in this way, in this way of seeing them as complex and what we call autopoietic systems that use energy and materials to reproduce themselves. And basically now social metabolism is like this very large field that provides tools, methods, analytical framework to understand the way that we as societies and at different scales we use energy and materials for different functions. And of course, this is something that is very, very much related to any topic that is related to the way that human beings are using resources and materials, like certain topics that political ecology, for example, is tackling. And I'm definitely not the best one to talk about political ecologies. This is a field actually I discovered when I arrived in here last year. What I can say about it, and maybe some of you can correct me and further push the discussion afterwards about political ecology, is that this is this field that largely looks at environmental interventions and makes critical studies of the causes and consequences of environmental interventions, and especially having a focus on the social science that lie behind those environmental interventions. So that's a very good introduction, this book. I didn't read the whole of it, but I learned actually quite a lot looking at this book from Tor Arve Benjaminsen, who's professor here, and Hanne Svastad. And the typical kind of interventions that are being studied. So that's traditionally maybe more in countries of what we called the global south. And typical interventions were typically private organizations settling down and threatening local livelihoods through certain types of environmental impacts, or changing land access regimes, or also public interventions that may also have influence on the local governance and local land use and natural resource use. And yeah, maybe this is maybe the largest way of seeing it, as studying all the social causes and impacts of environment change that are triggered by different kinds of actors. So I will leave it here for now. Just think about it further for the discussion during Judith's presentation. I think that's a very interesting question. Why do we talk about social metabolic research in this forum that is supposed to be dedicated to political ecology? And I hope we can discuss this further after your presentation, and thank you for being here. I'm looking forward.
Yep, thank you. So I'm Juudit Ottelin from the TNU. I have just started there this autumn, and before that I was at Aalto University, the real estate business research group, and my research has mainly focused on these carbon footprints of consumers in the context of the built environment, and then more generally like the sustainable built environment and sustainable urban systems. Today Lucas invited me to talk about the sociometabolic research. So I will kind of show you one perspective to this topic from my own, from the perspective of my own research. So I will start with this question that why we need this systems perspective when we think about these environmental impacts and environmental policies. And then I will talk about rebound effects of consumption, because that's kind of one of the answers why we need this systems perspective, is that it can reveal these rebound effects from one sector to another, or from one country to another country, and so on. I will start with the household level rebound effects, because those are kind of nice illustrations about what this phenomenon is about. And then I will go to the macroeconomic rebound effect, which is then maybe more interesting, or at least equally interesting from the policy perspective. Then I will shortly say something about this reduced consumption and degrowth, and what I think about some limitations of it. And then what I'm working on now is this can we actually reach this sustainable level of carbon footprints in these affluent countries like Nordic countries. Yeah, so why systems perspective? So usually when people start to think about environmental impacts, or if I discuss with people or businesses that are sort of starting to, they want to do something to their environmental impacts, but they don't know much about the topic. What they are usually thinking is the waste flows of their own actions, and then the direct emissions from transportation, for example. But that's an important aspect, but it's not the only thing that we should think about when we think about environmental impact of our actions and businesses and the society as a whole. So kind of the next step is to think about the life cycle perspective. So all of our products and services have a life cycle, and they are causing emissions and requiring resources in all steps of this life cycle. So they need the raw materials, and then the manufacturing part is causing emissions and takes energy. And then we have the distribution and the use phase, and then in the end the landfill. And this is kind of what we see. So maybe that's why we first always think about the waste, when we actually should maybe look at the holistic picture. Because if we only try to reduce the waste and the direct emissions of our actions, it might be that we are actually just shifting the burden to another life cycle phase. So that's one reason why we need these systemic approaches. And then the next thing is these first level rebound effects. So that's kind of when we start to think about the prices of different products. So for example, if you try to reduce your carbon footprint, or like the carbon footprint of a building, for example, by using reused materials or recycled materials, but they are also cheaper than the other alternative. It means that you are saving money, you are trying to save the emissions, and then what you need to think is about what will happen to the extra money that we are left with. And then we have the macroeconomic rebound, which is more than what if the whole society would shift from this alternative to another one, that would actually happen at the economic level, and that might again be kind of the results of these system approaches are often counterintuitive, so we don't always, it's difficult to predict what is the final outcome. And that's why we also need them, because it's not like your first assumption might be wrong. So, yeah. So, what sociometabolic research then does, it links these socioeconomic processes with these biophysical processes and studies the society-nature interactions. And there are various different system science approaches. I'm not very familiar with all of these, but I have really used environmentally extended impact analysis, carbon footprinting, and life cycle assessment. But actually these LCA approaches and IO approaches are kind of the, I think, the basis in many of these systems approaches anyway. And something that is common for these system approaches is that they can be used to study these rebound effects. So this is in my own field, where I study the emissions in the built environment. We basically have these two types of environmental accounting methods. And I think that we should be using both of these to kind of get a holistic picture of the emissions. So what has been traditionally used is this production-based accounting, in which we take the territorial boundaries of the city or a country or whatever that we are interested in, and then we take the calculate the direct emissions that are happening within the city boundaries. So the boundary transportation and industry, agriculture, and energy consumption. And this has been the traditional method, and this is, for example, on the basis of the Paris Agreement. But then there is the second way of accounting the emissions, and it's the consumption-based accounting. And then we again take the same city boundaries, but now we are interested in the residential area and how they consume, so what type of products and services they purchase. And then we follow the life cycle emissions of these products and services. So the emissions are caused by industry and transportation and agriculture and so on. But now it can be located anywhere in the world. So this type of assessment then captures when you purchase, for example, Chinese products, only allocate the emissions from the Chinese industry to that consumer. And as I mentioned, I think that in the sociometabolic research, it's important to look at both of these perspectives. So it's not that we want that the consumption-based perspective should replace this more traditional way of looking at things, but it's rather that we should use this in addition to give a better view. So this is an example of this carbon leakage phenomenon. So this is kind of the problem of using the territorial-based accounting alone, production-based accounting. So, for example, in Sweden, the territorial emissions have declined significantly during the past decades, but at the same time, the carbon footprint of Sweden, so the consumption-based emissions have remained largely the same. And the reason probably is that this is what we have been calculating, like in many countries, not just in Sweden. But in Sweden, they have also like had strong policies to decrease these territorial emissions, but they haven't really taken attention to the consumption-based emissions. Country either, but most recently, in recent years, I think that also countries and many cities have become more interested in these consumption-based emissions as well. So if you take, this only goes to 2017, so if you take the most recent years, you can see that even the consumption-based footprint of Sweden and some other developed countries has been declining. So at least we are now aware of this issue. And hopefully can do something. Yes, so then to the rebound effects. Yeah, so how many of you know already what is a rebound effect? Some of you.
I don't know.
Yes. Well, this example is from the consumer's perspective, but in theory it can be like any, it can be a business or policy intervention or whatever. But if we think about consumers, we basically have two types of sustainable choices that we can make. And the first one is these actions that save money at the same time that we save emissions. So, for example, if you give up your car and you start to use public transport or cycling or walking, you save a lot of emissions, transport-related emissions, but at the same time you also save a lot of money. And then the question is that what do you use with that money? So when you spend that on something else, that is again causing some emissions, and then those emissions are the rebound effect. So they kind of, the emissions rebound after you have taken the action. But then we have a more positive way of looking at the rebound effects as well, because the other type of sustainable choice that we can make is that we spend money on being sustainable. So, for example, if you choose some organic fair trade clothes, those are usually more expensive than the fast fashion. And you are actually spending more money on your sustainable choice. So you have to reduce your other consumption in order to afford that sustainable choice. Solar panels is another example, so it's quite expensive to buy solar panels still for a normal consumer, so you have to save money first and then you save money for the consumption. It reduces that part of your carbon footprint. So you kind of get these extra benefits in addition to the emission reduction that you were expecting. And these type of rebound effects are less studied than that type of, this is kind of more well known, this emissions somewhere else. But this is one of the things that I'm interested in. Yeah. So some practical examples. This is from our study where we compared the car-free households to car owners. And we further divided the car owners to light drivers and moderate drivers and late drivers. And yeah, the interesting finding was that the car-free group didn't have the lowest carbon footprint. But instead, the lowest carbon footprints were found in this group who own a car but don't use it very much. So the reason is of course the money. So when you own a car, you have a lot of expenses that actually aren't causing very much emissions. So the capital cost of purchasing a car or the loan to purchase a car, and then the insurances and taxes and maintenance cost and repair and everything, it doesn't really cause much emissions. So the only thing that causes emissions in owning a car is the driving part. So when you start to increase driving, your carbon footprint starts to increase very steeply. But then compared to the car-free people, since we control the income level, so this is only the middle income, and it's only the working people, because if you don't if you include everybody, there is in the car-free group also people who just don't have any mobility needs, so like very old people who are just moving 25%. So that's why we only do that the working middle income people, to make a more fair comparison. But yeah, the car-free people, they don't have well, they have very low carbon footprint from the personal vehicles, first of all. And then they have more money to spend on other consumption because they don't have a car, they are saving like, I don't know, 3,000 euros a year or something, which they can then spend on other consumption, so they have higher carbon footprint of other travel and services and I think products, yeah, and so on. And the other travel, this includes public transport and holiday travel, but emissions will come from flying. And we have some similar results based on travel service. Yeah, so that's kind of the bad side of rebound effects, that sometimes when we expect that the emissions should reduce a lot, they don't necessarily do so. But then we have let's skip this one, let's go to so then we have the nicer side of rebound effects is that when we actually spend money in order to be sustainable, we get these sort of double benefits. So this is from another study of ours, from Finland. And again, I have controlled the income levels and the household size. So this is middle income couples in Finland and only house and apartment owners. So I have excluded rental residents because we were interested, or I was interested in this picture to show the impact of the housing investment. Yeah, so the thing is that in this paper, we originally were interested in the impact of new energy efficient housing in different types of urban structures. And in general, if you read about rebound effects, they say that energy savings lead to these bad type of rebound effects, that when you save money, you're spending that and then increases your footprint. But we found something different. So if you look at the carbon footprint of housing energy, we can see that it is lower for the residents of new houses than old houses, but the difference is only around 400 kilos of CO2. And then if you look at the difference in the total carbon footprints, we can see that it's 1,000. So we get some extra 600 kilos of reduction from cemetery consumption. And then if we look at where it came from, it's from different categories like private vehicles and other travel and food and tangibles. So it's from different categories that don't really relate anyhow to the house. So the only explanation that we could find for this was that when we look at the expenditure of these two types of groups, we can see that the new house residents have much higher living costs. So they are paying higher mortgage payments. And then because the mortgage payments are so high, they have to reduce their consumption in other consumption categories. So the expenditure here is lower, and that is the reason why the total carbon footprint is lower. So this was kind of a surprise to me because this type of reports are not that much discussed in the literature. But okay, there is actually this. Sometimes it's called a negative rebound effect related to the capital costs, but it's negative in a mathematical sense, but like a positive phenomenon in the sense that it means that it's not emission reductions. Yes. Yeah, then to the macroeconomic rebound effect. So at the level of the global economy, we can see that the environmental efficiency has increased significantly during the past decades. So in particular in developing countries like China here and India, there has been strong increase in energy efficiency. So this shows the greenhouse gas emissions per 1,000 US dollars of economic output. So we can see that the emissions per monetary unit are decreasing in practically all countries. Also in developed countries like Japan and EU, the greenhouse gas intensity has been lower to begin with, but it's still like a declining trend. So this is kind of good news. This is what the decision makers like to show us, that we are going to the right direction. The emissions are decreasing at the same time that the economy is growing. But yeah, if you show the next slide, what has also happened is that the economy has grown significantly. So this is the global economy, and then when we multiply the economy with the greenhouse gas intensity, we end up with increasing greenhouse gas emissions and increasing global warming globally. Yeah. So I think that this macroeconomic rebound effect probably explains at least partly why we haven't achieved yet our climate targets that we have, but it's not very well understood that efficiency is actually also related to the increase in economy and increasing economic output. Yes.
I think skip to.
Yeah, so yeah, when I first found about this rebound effects of green investments, I was really excited about it. Like, I have something that I can suggest to every company that what you should do. You should just spend a lot of money on sustainability, and that will solve everything. But of course, after thinking about it a while, I realized that there are some problems to this approach as well. And the first is that usually when companies are thinking about green investments, they still think that it needs to be profitable. So for example, if they invest in solar panels, they expect that it will bring energy savings in the end, and in the end it will lead to monetary savings. So kind of after the repayment period is harmful rebound effects return again. So sort of we need this positive circle of investments that when we save money or we get profits from these green investments, we need to invest again on even greener technologies, because the technology is also developing over time. So we could create this sort of a positive cycle of green investments. Yeah, and the second problem is that from the environmental perspective, it's sort of good to invest in something that is unprofitable, that it doesn't bring any savings or profits. But of course, you cannot really recommend any company to do that type of investments, or cities for that one. So kind of we always end up in the situation that we have to think about the economy, because everybody are interested in the economic outcome of these solutions. So in the end, we cannot like kind of, if you as an engineer, you have this great technology that would be much greener than the one that is currently used. You think that this is great and we should use this, but the companies always ask that, is it, how expensive is it, and is it more expensive than the alternative? And then they don't choose it if it's more expensive. So that's kind of the problem. Green investments. Yes. Yeah, so that's actually why I think that we need also these system level solutions. So this transition from welfare state to an eco state. And basically what I mean by that is that I think that we need stronger environmental regulation. This is one good example from the EU. The energy efficiency regulation has increased the energy efficiency of our appliances a lot. And in addition to regulation, carbon pricing policies, I like those. I know that it's kind of problematic, and it's because it should be like international. That's the problem with carbon pricing policies. But the good news is that these carbon pricing policies or policy instruments are also increasing. So this is the number of carbon pricing policies, and this shows the share of emissions that are covered by these policies. So in 2017, 12% of units already. Yes. Yeah, there's something about this reduced consumption, because that's of course something that is always like suggested, that we just need to cut our consumption levels. Go to the next slide. Yep, so this picture shows the global carbon budget that we have. And we have the fossil emissions here and the land use change, and then we have the sinks on the other side. So there's sensing and Lansing. And then this is the problem. So this is the CO2 accumulating in the atmosphere. And in order to reach a sustainable level, we of course need to cut the emissions, but we can also try to do something with the things that we have. And this is the reason why it's kind of difficult to say what is like the sustainable level of carbon footprint. So it's not straightforward, but there are some studies that are trying to estimate in one way or another. And one example is this 10-year-old recent study, and they suggested that the current 1.5 degree target compatible carbon footprint per capita would be 3.6 tons of CO2 at the moment. So just as a comparison, I think that in Finland the carbon footprints are around 9 or 10 tons of CO2. Norway, a bit lower.
I'm not sure if it's lower in Norway
Oh, okay.
because of the
Higher consumption.
the oil and gas, and we have a lot of emissions.
Yeah.
So I normally use 10 tons.
Yes, the
Corporate figure.
Yeah. Well, Sweden is a little bit
I know.
better. Yes.
At least based on production.
Yeah. Yeah, well, this study look at it from the conservation perspective, or actually when you think about the limits, it doesn't really know limits. Approach you use. Yeah, and it should be reduced, of course, yeah, so I am a little bit skeptical about their reduced consumption. One of the reasons is this study that we did a couple of years ago, and here we calculated the consumer carbon footprints in Finland at the universal basic income level. So that's kind of the lowest income group in Finland. So you have the two basic needs fulfilled, you have food and shelter and things, but you don't have anything extra. And at this income level, the average carbon footprint is still almost 5 tons of CO2. So it doesn't quite reach the sustainable level, at least not in Finland, where we don't have fully renewable energy. Yeah, so basically if an average Finn would try to just to reach the sustainable level just by reducing consumption, I don't think that it would go very well. But rather we need also these technological solutions like renewable energy, electric vehicles, and so on. Yes. Yeah, well then hopefully some more positive examples in this last part. So can we become sustainable and still keep our standard of living? This is something that I'm working on with my colleagues in the University of Western. Yeah, so in this study we actually wanted to know like what is the greenhouse gas intensity of consumption that you need in different income levels in order to reach the sustainable carbon footprint. So here we use the same Kenyi's example of the sustainable levels. So here we can see the 3.6 carbon footprint. So this was the suggested sustainable footprint today. And then in 2030, we should reach this 2.5 tons of CO2 if we want to be sustainable. And then we have here the income level. And when the income level increases, you kind of need lower and lower greenhouse gas intensity all the time in order to reach the sustainable level. But what also happens in reality is that these higher income levels have lower greenhouse gas intensity. So as we can see, this actual carbon footprints of different income levels, even besides I think these groups, it kind of follows the same pattern as the ones that we need to reach. So yeah, so the bad news here was that if we just look at the average carbon footprints of different income groups, we can see that we are not reaching the sustainable level. Not even in the lowest income groups because of the higher greenhouse gas intensity, which is then related to the older vehicles and older houses consuming more energy. But then the good news is that we also have like sustainable choices that already take us to the sustainable level. So here, Sarah Olsen, who's the first author of this paper, she chose some like combinations of sustainable choices. So the first finding was that if you just take one of these sustainable choices, like just the electric vehicle or just the vegetarian diet, one isn't enough to bring you to the sustainable level in most cases. But if you take combinations of two different effective sustainable choices, then you already can get some examples of people who are reaching the sustainable level. So here we can see, for example, the vegetarian diet plus electric vehicle. That's the circles. And for example, in Iceland, we have in several income groups that are reaching the sustainable level. And we have these. And then the square is electric vehicle and renewable energy. So then we can see that, for example, in Sweden, there are income groups who then already land to the sustainable level. What should be noticed here is that this isn't a representative study of the population, of the whole population of these countries, but rather this survey was spread in the Facebook and was probably answered by people who are on average more interested in their carbon footprints and reducing that. But also when we look at like the average carbon footprints in different income deciles, I think that the outcome is quite similar as in household budget surveys in general. So I think that it's not representative, but it's also not like super biased. Yes. Yeah, so we can reach this sustainable level, at least some individuals can, but then we of course need also the system change because it's only a marginal group of people at the moment who are interested enough to make these voluntary choices. And what I'm also studying at the moment is kind of like what sort of policies and what sort of actions we need in different types of urban areas in order to build a sustainable built environment or have sustainable lifestyles. Because one of the things that our carbon footprint studies also show is that the idea that dense urban structure is always better, it doesn't hold when you look at the consumption-based emissions. It's usually so that the consumption-based emissions increase in more urban context because the income level is higher and you have more opportunities for consuming. So instead of saying that we need more dense or more some specific type of urban structure, I would rather suggest that we need different strategies to these suburban settings and detached houses versus then the most urban areas. So I think that we can make both types of built environment sustainable, but the solutions are probably a little different. Yeah, so as a conclusion, we need this system perspective to avoid these unintended consequences. And if you are interested in rebound effects, I think that the consumption-based accounting is the best approach to review them. Although the rebound effects are usually considered unwanted and problematic, I have actually found that there are also these desirable rebound effects. And then at the macroeconomic level, it probably explains at least partly why we haven't achieved our goals, and that's why we should somehow communicate this to the decision makers as well. We have already had like several decades of these climate strategies and climate policies, and still they aren't being very effective globally. Something structured. And yeah, the good news kind of is that for individuals who are interested to achieve the 1.5 degree target, like personally, it's possible already, I think. But also we need the system level change.
Perfect, thank you.
That's nice.
Okay, so now we'll have a brief discussion by Lucas.
Yeah, I was wondering actually how we should do it, because I have a few questions relating to what you just presented us, and probably some people have more. And my slide's open, so refer to certain of the aspects that you developed in the presentation. But I just got your slides before, and I was not sure about what you would exactly cover. So it's maybe questions that are a bit larger. Maybe we can stick to the questions that are very much focused on this presentation first. Yeah. So I was not sure whether everybody knows or exactly knows what carbon leakage, for example, is, the notion of carbon leakage. So I was wondering if you could maybe come back also on that and explain why it's important to consider. And I think it's really becoming also a topic now. The European Union, for example, is also discussing now how to address this. So it's quite important when you talk about rebound effects. Shall we start with this one?
Yeah, sure. So carbon leakage is in principle that when we try to reduce our local emissions, we might actually just shift the dirty industries to other countries and then increase the imports from there. And it's kind of, I think that there is the strong carbon leakage, which is that when we implement some policies, climate policies, then the industry would decide to move abroad. So that's kind of a strong carbon leakage, but I'm not sure that there is much evidence of this type of carbon leakage. So more usually it's the so-called weak carbon leakage, which simply means that when we, for example, have carbon pricing policies locally, then the consumers will start to consume more imports from other countries. So,
but is it necessarily policy related? I mean, the difference between the production-based and the consumption-based is just an empirical fact. And if industries like, say, Norway is not competitive, it's little to do with policies, but just because we are rich and have high wages, then things come from China.
True.
That's also a leakage effect, even it has no relation to specific environmental policies, right?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, it's also called carbon leakage. Yeah.
It's also a question of governments are accounting for the emissions of particular sectors. I think I looked at tourism in particular in Scotland, so for example, the cruise industry. And in theory, those emissions are being accounted for somewhere by somebody, but not within local development plans and within the national plans. It really wasn't clear. And in the end, get claimed kind of local reductions within a region, whereas actually they'd seen a massive increase in cruise tourism and a massive increase in local emissions, and this is totally not accounted for in any literature that I could find. Terrifying, because then it comes back to this issue where you're drawing boundaries in a system to actually capture that data. And I think governments at the moment seem to have an incentive that they are drawing tighter boundaries than maybe would be useful.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and international air travel is like one of the problems that no one wants to take responsibility of that. Everybody just excluded from their accounting. So yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, Hans, give it a-
Yeah, and just thank you. I just, well, I can follow most of your arguments, I think, but the one on the carbon intensity going down that much with income was surprising to me, because you're thinking the more rich you are, you also have more extravagant kind of consumption patterns. You travel much more and so on. So have you looked into what is kind of the main reason for this? Because I don't know, in absolute figures, they would still emit more, I guess, than, like say, if you can take $10,000 and $20,000 or $50,000. But where is the kind of structural changes that still makes the figure look like it does?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I actually haven't checked yet with this data, though just as a in a general level, I think that these higher income households, they consume more on services than products, and then that might that decreases the greenhouse gas intensity, and also if they have more energy efficient houses and vehicles.
I have actually an element of answer on that, because a previous colleague of mine actually was working on this topic, and he looked at different income categories over Europe and different countries, and how what was the energy intensity per expenditure, and also what the overall expenditure were in categories, and in the end how much overall consumption or how much overall greenhouse gas emissions and energy consumption it was. And yeah, clearly they good housing service. Interesting that for sectors like mobility, of course, the energy is lower because maybe more efficient vehicles were used, but also much more service was used in the end. So of course, the internet matched up by the expenditures. I can send you.
P figures and the total mass consumption in a way, and material consumption is almost not a straight line, but they follow each other very neatly. Then it's different with carbon. It still is different. But they say that when it comes to the material, at least, they don't find that the change to a service economy has any positive effect. So whether it's a rebound thing or what it is, they don't know. But so what is then different with carbon again? I think it's because you should have the same, in a sense, market mechanisms that also I think drives, well, it's also the regulations you have on carbon, but it starts way before you have any regulations on carbon, that you see a difference between the GDP growth and the growth in the use of fossil fuels. So there the kind of the economizing mechanism of markets work, but it doesn't work for materials. Somebody said in the meeting I was on Friday that, well, you can substitute energy, but you cannot substitute anything like materials for materials. There isn't any material without material. But I think that is a simple answer.
I was also wondering in the thing you showed where you looked if people were to have a vegan diet and, for example, electric vehicles, then you look at carbon, right? But could you also consider rebound effects, for example, across different planetary boundaries? So if, like, how it would impact land use change, for example, if you have a lot of people driving electric vehicles?
Yeah, that's also one of the topics that I'm interested about, these sort of trade-offs between different environmental inequalities. I'm not sure if this data set is suitable for that, because the survey was kind of planned from the perspective of calculating the carbon footprint. So we have a lot of questions related to energy and fuels, for example, but not so detailed about the food, for example. So I think that land use might be difficult to estimate.
I have another question on this notion of eco-states that you mentioned, and maybe if you could come back to what you exactly define as an eco-state and as compared to welfare state. And from what I understood now, or at least that was the two aspects you were presenting here, it was about the degree of regulation on environmental regulation, and you were also mentioning carbon pricing as one of the strategies, but I didn't really get what you meant by eco-state, or is that how you define it?
I probably shouldn't try to define eco-state in this political scientist, since I'm an engineer from my background, so I don't really I don't have an economics background or policy science background in a sense, but I'm just interested in these topics, and kind of as an engineer I have realized that technology is not going to solve these problems unless we do something also at the societal level. So that's kind of why I'm interested in what sort of governmental policies we will need as well. So by eco-state, I just mean that we need stronger environmental policies than we currently have, but I'm not sure how much stronger, for example. And as I mentioned, I kind of like carbon pricing policies in a theory, because in theory they could bring all the greenhouse gas intensities of different products to the same level, for example. But in practice, that might be difficult. And also, we would kind of need to continuously reduce the intensity, so it's not enough to get it on a certain level, but if the economy keeps growing, we need to keep decreasing. So I don't know how that should be done in practice. So in practice, I think that these regulations, like the energy efficiency regulation, might sometimes work better, or just like forbidding these combustion engine vehicles, for example, as a regulation that might work better than carbon pricing in the end. I'm not sure. Actually, I'm interested in your thoughts.
I was wondering because, for example, some governments now in France, I think we will not have it, but it has been discussed last year, for example, to change our constitution and integrate environmental questions in the constitution. So if that was maybe something you had in mind, or I was just curious because you used the word, but it's not that.
It's not like in the forum.
I don't know, but well, this is interesting also in relation to the concept of systems, because you concentrate, and I understand that, no problem, on the physical system. Certainly there are actors in it, but that it's what they do with kind of materials and energy. And that's where I don't know if you have your center have any cooperation with, to talk about political scientists and other people there, because a lot of these changes may have to happen on the level of how we make decisions, both at political and more kind of economic sphere type of. I just recognized you said firms have to be profitable. Not necessarily.
Yeah.
If you have other owners, then the kind of owners we have today, we can manage. Or certainly they have to pay on the money that they borrow, they have to pay back. But you can do a lot of activities without making profits if you have type of owners that have different goals. And there are firms experimenting with these kinds of organizational structures, right? They don't need to grow. Or they may grow because they want to take over have a more green economy, right? But their mission isn't to make profits, but to do good. And this may be naive, I don't know. But I think it's extremely important that the kind of research you do gets related to those who look at what consumers do, those who look at what happens at the political and economic level. So at some point, I don't know how difficult it is for an engineer, but I think that should be possible. And I don't know at the center you are in Trondheim, if your colleagues also, there are some social scientists there, or are there dominantly natural science all through?
Yeah, with the ecological.
No problem with that, but that door should somebody try to open.
Yeah, that's right.
There's also one of the points I was thinking about when you talked about this positive circle of green investment. It's not even that investments today, they are not directed towards something that is profitable. It's just that they are turned also towards something that is the most profitable and whatever, you know. And if because of certain arrangements, then something that may be more efficient from an environmental point of view will be profitable then, or the most profitable companies will probably naturally turn towards that. But when you talk about big groups that are mostly, or the large strategy is mostly driven by the search of profit, of course, the first choice will be the one that will bring the most money to the investors. So for sure, that's not something set in marble. Yeah, I think also that's an interesting, exciting topic. I had another question also about individual choices and whether also you, because I think somehow you also addressed it a bit. You said also that we're not like those choices, they happen within certain structures. And for example, the urban form, you were talking about infrastructures, that somehow our choices are shaped by those arrangements. But I think it's both a material structure that shapes our choices, but also social structures. And there's a whole literature on social practices and how our individual behaviors and choices are also influenced by culture and social norms. And even larger than that, everything we call institutions. Adil can talk a bit about it. That's really much his topic. So how like different things that we have normatively agreed on. It can be organizations, it can be norms, it can be elements of culture, but how also all those things in the end, they also influence quite a lot of our choices. And yeah, when we talk about changing behaviors, that it's something actually that touches also at some point at those structures, both social structures, but also the material ones that you were mentioning, that somehow we have to be aware of, that they are also either a break or maybe something we can base ourselves on to make things change. I don't know if you, because you reflected a bit on the material side, but also if you thought also a bit about this social side.
Yeah, I think that it's definitely important because we can always see that in our like personal choices, that we are not making our consumption choices simply based on these environmental aspects. We also have always other reasons to consume or not consume something. I haven't studied that much because I'm more focused on this modeling of the environmental flows and not really on the like behavioral side of it. It is important, of course.
So would you say that there's a lack of interdisciplinarity in that sense in this field?
Yeah, it's a very
interdisciplinarity, focusing mainly with building bridges with social sciences.
Yeah, it's a very interdisciplinary field, and in our group at Aalto University there were a lot of social scientists as well, or at least economists. Yeah, and also like architects, and yeah, it's a very interdisciplinary disciplinary topic in general.
I have a few slides for more general comments, maybe on the presentation, but if there is any specific questions on the presentation. Okay. I will try also to have them here. My comments. Yeah, so you can move directly to this slide. Yes. Yeah, so I was just looking at the slides you sent me a few days ago, and also I had the opportunity to read a few of the papers that you wrote, which I really appreciated. I thought maybe of 3 points maybe to raise now as part also of the Political Ecology Forum, and also again I was suggesting you to think about why are we talking about social metabolism in a forum dedicated to political ecology. So I hope to provide maybe a few elements of answers on the relevance of interdisciplinarity between the political ecology and social metabolism to the benefit of the two fields. So yeah, you can go to the next slide. We'll start coming back to this notion of consumption-based approaches that you mentioned, and I really see a relevance for much more people than people involved in social metabolism in understanding what consumption-based approaches are and how they can also enable us to understand how the world works nowadays in economies that are very much globalized and with very strong interdependencies between territories that are only connected through the economy. So you can move to the next slide. Yeah, I want to redefine those two approaches you presented us. So, yeah, the production-based approach that really accounts for the activities that physically happen on the territory that we consider, and consumption-based approach that looks more at the type of things that we rely on given certain consumption patterns. Yeah, I think it actually, more than just two accounting framework, to me, I really see them as two different ways of conceptualizing even what an economy is and what's the purpose of an economy. And the production-based approach is very much related to this understanding of economic activities also as and in itself. You can also, just looking at production-based accounting, have this tendency to think that an economy, if you look, for example, at Norway, a thriving economy can sustain on mostly public services and oil rent, and without really looking further, not looking at, for example, the things that we're consuming and that somewhere else some people have to take care of. So that's very interesting, I think, to have the two approaches. It's not that production-based or consumption-based, one is more true than the other, but they just raise different problematics. And the consumption-based approach is maybe more related to this understanding of the economy that is geared towards the purpose of things that we are producing for final consumption. All the intermediary activities, they serve a purpose. It is this final consumption.
Can you?
Should I?
Because I need to get mine.
Yeah, no worries. So yeah. Yeah, I think, in that sense, consumption-based approach gives a completely different understanding of what the economy is supposed to be, and it also has strong implications on the kind of strategies that we can prioritize. And for example, looking at just are we able to produce more added value than oil rent probably, and just looking at how the financialization of an economy happens, would probably be enough to consider that an economy is thriving. But if we consider the things that we actually need in the end, and the purpose of having economic activities is, for example, to get food in the end, then it makes sense to look at where our food comes from. And we know in Norway there's also increasing debates on this topic, for example, that more and more over the years, Norway has become dependent on imports, and it makes sense in the end to look at that if the final purpose of the economy is not just producing but also consuming things. Yeah. So yeah, the consumption-based approach, I think, also is very critical, or making the distinction at least between the two approaches. It really helps also to better differentiate the situations in which social or environmental problems get solved from the ones where problems get displaced. And I think this is really where I see the point also of consumption-based approach for people who are interested at the social costs and consequences of environmental interventions, that those things, they are somehow related because they serve final consumption somewhere. And that's probably like the link that you can make, the link that you can make, between things that we consume here and that have social impacts elsewhere. So maybe social metabolism in that sense can help political ecologists look at where things go to, where do they come from, and what are the social environmental consequences, and how are they inscribed in larger global dynamics. Another element that I think makes sense, that comes from this distinction social metabolic researchers make between consumption and production-based approaches, is to look at those dynamics of ecological exchange between countries. That is very hard to see if you only look at the production-based approach. How much we rely on imports coming from that country, how much that country relies on imports that another country will send out, and try to make this balance of things that you send out, things that you get in, and try to figure out how biophysical resources flow through economies, and I think it really helps, for example, to enlighten early theories that development studies had, for example, in the 70s, the development theory that was looking at the global economies as a world system where there were like wealthy nations in the center that were absorbing biophysical resources coming from core nations. And it was promising theories, but probably there was not so much tools also to give empirical analysis and give empirical ground to those theories. And in that sense, I think that social metabolic approaches really bring a lot, and there's much more actually that can be appropriated by political ecologists in that sense to understand those kind of dynamics. Yeah. This also somehow kinds of help to dissipate this illusion that we have, and this is kind of the graph that you were also presenting before. I took again the territorial material and CO2 emissions from Norway on one side, and the footprint from material and greenhouse gas emissions in Norway. And if you look at those two accounting frameworks, they give very, very different stories. Of course, the one with production-based approaches that we really tend to rely less and less on materials and greenhouse gas emissions for thriving economies. And if we look at actually what we consume, then we have the opposite pictures. So it really helps, I think, to correct a lot of illusions that we can easily have when we only look at what happens physically, because the only physical link in the end that we have if we don't look at data, the only physical link that you will see is probably just the containers getting out and in from the harbors, and that's something that people will probably have a hard time to imagine all the social and environmental consequences related to it. I think as soon as you displace an activity, then it's very hard to realize all the consequences that they have. And this is exactly the same. So we were talking mostly about resources and greenhouse gas emissions, but social metabolism also enables to make the same kind of analysis with, for example, flows of work and what amount of work is being embodied in things that people import and export. And that's one of the topics I'm currently busy with. And if you look at, for example, the difference between the domestic work in Norway and the work footprint, or how much work is being embedded in all the things that people consume, then it gives a very different pictures. And it somehow also dismisses this idea that we have emancipated ourselves from all the work that relates to material production, agriculture, raw material extraction, and raw material transformation, and all those things that somehow we feel we have completely emancipated ourselves on. It's also true that we have become more efficient in carrying out those activities, but it's also very, very clear that we have offshore also a large of these activities, and so this idea of tertiarization of the economy or shift towards service economy kinds of falls apart when we start to look at footprints, and this is very interesting. So I tried to find a picture to kind of represent this idea of correcting the illusion with consumption-based approach, and so that's the one I found. With the production-based accounting, you will have this illusion of flying, and then you have to also look at the roots of where you stand and what you actually rely on. Yeah, once again, I think you were also quite clear about it. It's not that one is not true or more true than the other, but they are very complementary, and for sure, consumption-based accounting for now doesn't have as much space in our understanding of how economies work as production ones. Another aspect I wanted to briefly mention or touch upon is this notion of degrowth you were touching upon, and here I talk about biophysical degrowth in countries with high ecological overshoots. I think this is something also that makes a lot of sense to study, both from the political ecology and sociometabolic approaches. So I think it is still controverted, this framework of the planetary boundaries, but I think that we start to reach a consensus, and it's being now more and more also promoted by a lot of institutions. It's very clear now in the European Union, for example, that the planetary boundary framework will be used in, for example, in the last, how is that called again? The name? In the last, the Environmental Action Program of the European Union, for example, makes explicit mention to the planetary boundary framework. So yeah, everybody or almost everybody starts to agree on this framework and the fact that there are some ecological overshoots, but and we have to somehow decrease our pressures on those overshoots. But then what entails this, you know, for different countries and also for like the actions that we're supposed to take, this is where actually the big disagreement arise. And the first of them that I wanted maybe to mention is the one whether reaching back ecological limits would actually entail reducing resource use, and that's what I call biophysical resource or biophysical degrowth. Because you will see here that there is no mention of resource use or energy use per se. Here we talk about environmental impacts, and for sure, environmental resource is not an environmental impact per se, but it's very clear, and there's ample evidence that is very, very strongly correlated to a lot of those environmental pressures. And for example, one biodiversity loss and land use, and if you talk about energy carriers, of course, fossil fuels are responsible for climate change. So I think that it looks like a reasonable basis to somehow agree on that yes, we want to reduce environmental pressures, but for this somehow we will also have to reduce resource use. But this is more kind of a consequence of the fact that they are very strongly correlated, and that this decorrelation or decoupling with maybe how to achieve that. We'll come back on that. Another aspect is the distributive justice argument for biophysical degrowth in countries with high ecological overshoots. The fact, the idea that if there are some ecological limits, why would some countries be more entitled to their share than other ones? And clearly, some countries nowadays are overshooting the limits, while others are not, and at the same time, be strongly deprived of some of the social foundations that they need. So there is this distributive argument to say that in countries with high ecological overshoots, this is where actually biophysical degrowth should happen in the first place. And another argument for biophysical degrowth in those countries is the sufficientarianist one, that yeah, it's a hard word.
It's like just add on.
So it's based on this empirical observation that at high levels of material consumption and environmental footprints, additional material consumption adds less to human development than at lower levels of material consumption. So that can also be used as an ethical argument that it is mostly in high-income countries where it has actually less impacts on well-being that biophysical degrowth should happen. I will not dive too much in debate, but obviously there is a very, very strong schism between within people that think that we have to reach back planetary boundaries, and Johan Rockström, who's the lead author of the original framework here, you can see his name. That you can see that people that share this observation have a very, very different interpretation of the implications also for societies, and whether we can actually enable economic activities to decouple enough from the environmental impacts that they are related to or not, and if decoupling is a strategy that itself alone can enable to reach back ecological limits. I think this is kind of like the strong point of divergences in this debate. And so I just wanted to remember to briefly touch upon that there is actually evidence, and very strong evidence. There was this big studies carried out 2 years ago on reviewing the evidence on decoupling between GDP and resource use, and GDP and greenhouse gas emissions, and also trying to be a bit consistent about what we want, what kind of decoupling we want, and the kind of decoupling we want is a decoupling that is both production but also footprint-based, so no displacement of environmental impacts, that is fast enough, that happens in the time frame that we want, because if we overshoot the limits for too long, then we will probably not be able to come back within the safe space. It has to be absolute, and it has to be permanent, it has to be sufficient, so we have to reach back these levels, and trying to characterize decoupling in this kind of clearer terms, then it appears very clearly that this is the kind of decoupling that we have never achieved. And it doesn't mean anything about the future, right? What we have achieved or not, because we have not achieved sustainability neither in any other forms that we would like to see. So it doesn't say anything, but what is for sure is that there are at least some worries about our capability of just using decoupling as our strategy to reach back safe environmental limits. And some of those arguments are presented in this report, which is not peer reviewed, but very well written by very renowned scientists that otherwise also publish in peer reviewed publications. This one is not, but I think it raises also to some of the arguments that are regularly raised. It's just more a summary of them in this report from the European Environmental Bureau.
3 more minutes.
All right, I will. Yeah, that's fine. That's perfect, actually. And I just wanted to now try to bring some constructive elements in this debate, because I think that for sure the question of whether decoupling or not itself will be sufficient to reach back ecological limits can be a very long debate, and probably that by the time that we will maybe have found an answer, the planet won't be inhabitable anymore if we stick to theoretical evidence. And maybe the right approach is to consider that there are actually good reasons not to rely only on decoupling. And I found this op-ed from Beth Stratford a few years ago, which I found very interesting, about trying to find like the kind of common ground that exists actually, or that can be found between people advocating between decoupling and those that think that this might not be sufficient. And what's for sure is that you don't need to be a green growther, as she said, to recognize the need for an unprecedented technological transformation and the need for decoupling. It's absolutely needed. As much as possible, we need to find the right technological answers, if they are also not creating additional environmental pressures along, or if they are not just displacing environmental pressures. But if we have the right technological transformation, they are more than needed, and all that can be taken in that sense needs to be taken. Also, you don't need to be a green growther to recognize that societies are largely dependent to growth, and this is of course a barrier. And then it's more about, if we are dependent to growth, then how can we also alleviate the dependence? On the other side, you don't need to be a degrowth advocate to recognize all the risks that are involved with relying solely on decoupling, given the fact that we only have one shot and one window of opportunity, which is now, and that all efforts, including decoupling, but also all the efforts that we can take in addition, and for example, reducing our dependence to growth are good to take. And this is the reason also why you don't need to be a degrowth advocate to support policies that would reduce growth dependence. Yeah, I talked already probably too much. I just wanted to show you this diagram I made when I was thinking about this seminar, and I see also, social metabolic research and political ecology. I can clearly see different approaches in the kind of questions that we raise, but there's for sure a gray ground where we actually have a lot of potential to work on questions, similar questions, and then we saw it today with the questions that got raised, but also questions when you look at biophysical flows, who benefits from them, and what kind of power arrangements lie behind those kind of biophysical arrangements, and what are trying to have a social understanding of the physical fact of biophysical flow, I think is where we can really work together. So sorry for being a bit long. That's it.
Great, so we run out of time, but I think we had a dynamic and very interesting discussion. We'll hope to see you maybe working in the future together, who knows? And thanks to the audience for joining the seminar. See you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.